Hello everyone, welcome to Sermon Notes. This week we're looking at Matthew chapter 14. We're looking at those two stories, the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water, and how those two stories connect with Exodus events. So doing our biblical theology from the time of the Exodus to those stories happening at the time of Jesus, there's a theology running through scriptures that God is present with his people. Okay, let's look at those stories from Exodus and see how they connect with Matthew chapter 14. And we're really going to camp on that last story around Mount Sinai and the tabernacle. But let's make those connections first. Looking at the book of Exodus, and first of all, looking at chapter 14, that's where we get the story of God and leading the people of Israel across the Red Sea. And with this story, we're showing that God is present. Israel's God is among his people. That's the biblical theology thread that we're following all along here. God is present with his people, both in this cloud that is present during the day, and then fire coming from the cloud at night. God is present with his people and leads them safely to this through the Red Sea and to this desert place where the second story that connects with Matthew chapter 14 is the story of manna and quail, and that's in chapter 16 of Exodus. And that's where this incredible bread, mysterious, beautiful manna comes from the sky. That's a loaf of bread. Looks like a barn, but it's a loaf of bread, and it's a representation again of the reality that Israel's God is among his people. Both that cloud of mystery did in fact go with the people of Israel, fiery presence at night, and providing for his people. Well, that's chapter 16. And then in chapter 19, the people of Israel arrive at Mount Sinai. That's the mountain there. Looks like the Rocky Mountains, but it's not. And the presence of God is there. It descends upon the top of the mountain in that mysterious cloud during the day, and the fiery presence of God in that cloud by night. Moses comes up to that mountain place because God tells him to come up there so that the people of Israel will see you talking to me from this cloud. Come up into this cloud so that they'll see Israel's God is among them. Well, while they are seeing this presence of God there among them, Moses is receiving the Ten Commandments and receiving instructions to build a tabernacle. And that's the third story that we want to connect with. Before we do that, though, let's just draw the connection into Matthew chapter 14. The connection is that the Red Sea is connecting with Jesus walking on water. And the connection with chapter 16 and the manna is Jesus feeding the 5,000. And now we're going to look at the connection in both of these stories of the presence of God among them in the person of Jesus himself as we look at the tabernacle story. Well, go ahead and erase this now, and let's take a closer look at the tabernacle. Well, let's look at the tabernacle construction, keeping in mind always that the tabernacle is about Israel's God being present among his people. That's what the tabernacle is about. The construction of the tabernacle looked like a rectangle, and that rectangle was made of curtains. There were walls that were put up that were like curtains, and there was a gate at the center, and as you came inside this outer courtyard area, you would have come across an altar. That altar was for burnt sacrifices, and then behind the altar in this outer courtyard was a washing basin, a laver here. Priests would wash themselves there and be purified in order to come into a large room This rectangular structure here was actually 2 rooms. There was an inner room here that was called the holy place, and then an inner room here, which was the holy of holy places, the most holy place. Inside this holy place, as the priests would have walked in here, you would have seen, if you were a priest, that there was a table here on this side of the wall, and this table had on top of it the showbread. And this showbread here, there were 12 loaves of this bread that were always present here throughout the week. The bread was placed upon that table, and then every Sabbath it was replaced with new loaves. 12 loaves of bread. While that is being lit up inside that room, there's some light upon that. Where does the light come from? The light comes from a large candelabra here, the menorah. And this candelabra here has 7 candles on it. 7 candles. So the light would have been shining across there. The light that's coming from these candelabras represented the presence of God. Remember, this is what's going on here in the tabernacle, that God is present among his people. And the light is showing that, and the connection that Israel is making, and you're probably making as well, is that the light is coming from the fiery presence of God through the evening, through the nighttime. There is light given to the people of God, to Israel, to lead them because he's present with them. That's happening here in the candelabra. It's happening here in this dark room that is being lit up because Israel's among his people. 12 loaves of bread, 12 tribes of Israel. Israel, you know your God is among you. You've seen that in this incredible miracle of nature in their visible eye that's on the top of Mount Sinai as this tabernacle is being constructed. As it's being set up, they can see that presence of God. It's not just the fiery presence, though. There's one more thing inside of this holy room here. There's an altar here. An altar just before you go into the holy of holiest places. There's an altar here, and this altar is an altar of incense. And there's incense burning there right from the morning when the priests come in during the morning sacrifice to light this altar of incense, and it gets lit again in the evening, so that always inside of this room there is smoke, and there is the smell, the fragrance of God's presence with his people. And that smoke and the smell of that fragrance, I'll go back over here to this picture of the fiery presence of God. That is representing so well the visual experience that Israel is having of their God among them, in their midst. At this time as it's being constructed, as the first time this altar was ever being placed inside the holy room, they could see at the top of Mount Sinai this smoky mystery and presence of God. Well, inside this room, then, we have the fiery presence of God, the smoke and the mysterious cloud presence of God for the 12 tribes of Israel. Israel's God is in their presence. Well, as you were to move then from this holy room into the holy of holiest rooms, which was only accessed once a year, and that was on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And on that day, the priest would go into this holy of holy rooms where the Ark of the Covenant was. And that's where the presence of God was, in this holy of holy rooms. And so when Exodus 40 comes about, let's put this down for us here, Exodus 40, that's when this construction has been completed. And there's a consecrating that takes place where Moses goes around making these structures holy for the presence of God to come upon and to come into. And so he's anointing with oil all of these things. With consecration, there's the altar, and there's the horns on the altar. There's the laver for purification coming into this holy room, and there's a consecrating of the candelabra, consecrating of the showbread table, consecrating of the altar of incense, and consecration inside this holy of holy places for the ark. Well, then, with this being completed in Exodus 40, we see a miracle happen. We see the Shekinah glory of God, his very presence, leave the mountaintop and come and reside over the temple. And so there, the cloud of mystery and the fiery presence of God is there in the temple, into the tabernacle. I think I said temple, which happens later on in time with Solomon's temple. But here in the tabernacle, the presence of Yahweh among his people. Well, there's a connection that goes on throughout our biblical history of God's presence among his people. I accidentally gave one of those away, that after the tabernacle comes the temple, where this very same presence of God comes into the temple place, and a similar construction there for the temple place. Throughout biblical history, God is with his people, and Matthew wants us to know that Jesus is in fact Israel's God. Yeah. Yahweh is present among his people. Matthew starts off his gospel by saying God is with us. He's among us. And then in chapter 14, we see this incredible evidence, this great proof, this great demonstration that Jesus gives. By standing atop the water, he is Israel's God that led his people through the Red Sea. By giving of this 5,000 people bread from heaven, it is manna, because Israel's God is among his people. And how many basketfuls of bread were gathered up after the miracle of the 5,000? 12 basketfuls were gathered up after that. Jesus is in fact Israel's God among his people. And so those two stories from Matthew 14 draw that out for us and encourage us to know this truth. And the tabernacle is the Exodus representation, the Exodus story and reality of Yahweh among his people. And in Matthew 14, that tabernacle is in fact present again. Present again in the person of Jesus. He is the tabernacle. The theology runs straight through the Bible story. And so we can know as we read through this and Jesus walking upon the water and multiplying the bread, that the tabernacle is present among God's people. Well, I hope this encourages you today as you think about this ancient story that has such relevance in the first century, and how that first century story continues to have relevance into our day in which we live in, where we as believers are motivated, encouraged, and we are blessed as we move forward in our faith, knowing that Israel's God, our God, is among us today. God bless you.